The cemetery where souls do not rest. Arrival at the cemetery. It was a moonless night, and the wind cut through the air with an unusual chill, as if it was pressing everything around it. The scene was perfect for desolation, with twisted trees seeming to embrace the cemetery, forming a natural wall. The thick fog, rising from the ground, seemed to have a life of its own, crawling in a strange and terrifying way, swallowing the steps of anyone who dared to enter that cursed place. Lucas and Marcos were there for one reason: the mystery. They had heard about a forgotten cemetery, a place where souls never rested. Old stories claimed that anyone who entered would never leave in the same way. Fear had to be faced, adrenaline had to be felt, and curiosity pushed them into that forbidden territory. The place seemed dead, but something was there. Something unseen, yet felt. The sensation that every step was being watched, as if the cemetery itself was alive and waiting patiently for anyone who dared disrespect its silence. The tombstones were broken, fallen, and covered in moss, a sad and morbid landscape. The smell of damp earth and the cold wind formed a combination that sent shivers down the spine. When Marcos took the first step into the cemetery, the sound of his foot touching the ground echoed strangely, as if the sound was absorbed by the earth, leaving only emptiness in response. "I don't like this," Lucas murmured. He could feel it. The air was dense, as if the very atmosphere was filled with something impure, something that shouldn't be there. "Let's hurry up and see what we find," said Marcos, trying to hide the unease in his voice, but his expression betrayed his fear. They continued, ignoring the growing sense of dread. It was then that they heard the first sigh. Almost imperceptible, but something was there. An invisible presence. A heavy breath that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Something that couldn't be explained. The wind brought with it a low murmur, like a distant whisper, blending with the sound of the fog. It was as if the earth itself was speaking, calling them. Marcos laughed nervously, trying to push away the darkest thoughts. But Lucas knew. He knew something was there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then, in the distance, something moved. A figure, a shadow that appeared between the trees. Something that couldn't be clearly identified, but it was definitely watching them. The woman of the cemetery. As the fog closed around them, the figure became more visible. It was a woman, tall, with a black cloak that seemed to float in the wind. Her steps were soft, almost ethereal, as if she was walking in a different dimension. Her face, pale and devoid of expression, was covered by a mask of shadows that made it impossible to identify any detail. Her eyes glowed with a spectral light, deeply empty, as if they didn't belong to this world. Marco shuddered when he saw her, a chill running up his spine. She's coming towards us," he whispered, his voice trembling. Lucas instinctively grabbed Marcos' hand, and the two slowly backed away, not wanting to make any sudden movements. But, against their will, their bodies were drawn towards the woman. It was as if an invisible force was pulling them, making their feet move forward, unable to resist. The woman stopped a few meters from them and, without saying a word, looked at them with her glowing eyes, as if piercing their souls. The feeling of dread took over them, but there was no escaping anymore. The cemetery seemed to swallow everything, as if the fog walls around them trapped them in an alternate reality, a dimension where time didn't exist, where the rules of life and death were distorted. And then she spoke. Her voice, soft and deep, seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not from her mouth, but from the very earth that surrounded them. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing like a warning and a curse at the same time. "Here, the souls do not rest. They wait. They wait for you." Marcos, trembling, didn't know what to do. The woman was no longer alone. Around her, shadows began to emerge from the ground. Human forms, but distorted, with empty eyes, as if they no longer had souls. They were pale, lifeless figures that moved slowly toward the two friends. Lucas couldn't look back anymore. Fear paralyzed him, but he knew something worse was coming. The woman approached, her feet not touching the ground. She floated, and her penetrating gaze made everything around them lose color, as if reality itself was being sucked in by her. "There is no escape," she said. "The cemetery is alive, and the souls that live here never let their visitors leave. No matter how hard they try, the awakening of the shadows." Marcos, completely immobilized by fear, tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The terror was so intense that he couldn't even breathe properly. Lucas, on the other hand, was trying to process everything that was happening, but the woman's words wouldn't leave his mind. The souls do not rest. What did that mean? Who were those figures emerging from the ground? And most importantly, what did she want from them? Before they could react, the figures began to move, walking toward them with a supernatural slowness. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange smell, like rotten earth mixed with something else. Something that couldn't be identified, but immediately made them feel a deep nausea. Lucas tried to scream, but his throat seemed tight. Nothing came out of his mouth. Then the ground trembled. The earth shook as if it were alive, as if something was waking up from the depths of the cemetery, something that should not be awakened. Marcos fell to his knees, clutching his chest, as the shadows moved closer, their opaque eyes fixed on the two friends. They were surrounded, but the cemetery wouldn't let them leave. Every breath felt heavier, denser, and time seemed to stop. The sensation of being trapped in an endless reality took over them, an invisible prison where terror was the only constant. And then, the woman spoke again, her voice quieter now, as if she were whispering a dark secret. "The earth always takes what is yours," she said. "Now you are part of it. Forever." The labyrinth of lost souls. Lucas felt his mind starting to lose control. Everything around him seemed distorted. The shadows danced around him, as if reality was breaking, disintegrating into pieces. He looked at Marcos, who was completely paralyzed, his eyes wide with pure terror. The cemetery seemed to absorb everything, his memories, his emotions, his very essence. The woman began to walk in circles around them, her gaze never leaving the two victims. "Now you are mine," she murmured, her voice soft but carrying a sinister power. "You will walk the labyrinths of lost souls, where time does not exist, where death is never final." A door appeared before them, a dark and impenetrable entrance inviting them in. Lucas, his heart racing, tried to look for an exit, but there was no path left. He felt that, even if they tried to escape, they were completely surrounded, like rats trapped in a cage. And then, something much deeper, something insane, began to happen. The ground beneath them opened, and the distorted figures began to rise from the earth, as if they were part of the cemetery itself. They were no longer shadows. They now had shapes, faces, bodies that twisted and writhed in agony. "Follow me," the woman said, her words colder than the freezing wind that now surrounded them. "Follow me, and you will discover the fate of all those who have fallen here. You will never escape. The eye of the abyss." The figures were getting closer. The cemetery seemed to be breathing with the movement of the shadows. Marcos tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground, as if the earth was pulling him in. Lucas felt incapable of moving, an invisible force holding him, unable to react. The woman, silently, watched it all. She seemed pleased with the terror she was causing, as if she were feeding off it. "You are not the first," she whispered. "You will not be the last. All who enter here are condemned to wander eternally." The figures began to approach with slow, dragging steps, as if the cemetery itself was forcing them to move toward the abyss. Marcos tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the growing darkness. And then, the woman turned to him and spoke again, her words even graver, as if echoing from the depths of hell. "Your destinies are sealed," she said. Now you belong to us. The eternal silence. The cemetery, now completely engulfed in darkness, seemed to live a new story. Lucas and Marcos had become part of that cursed place, their souls wandering among the shadows. What would happen next, no one would know. The woman had disappeared, but the cemetery continued to call, waiting for the next victim. And so, the cycle would repeat eternally.